I'm Lois from Arch Street Meeting, and tonight's speaker is Greg Barnes from Central Philadelphia Meeting. He has written several books about Quakerism, including Philadelphia's Arch Street Meeting House and a centennial history of the American Friends Service Committee, as well as fiction about people's lives in Africa. Today, he will speak about his experience as one of the very first Peace Corps volunteers. The title of the book he'll be discussing tonight is The Peace Corps, Early Days.
Thanks, Lois, and thank you for tuning in. And I need to thank Yoko, who is my wife and who put up the PowerPoint pictures. And could we have first the picture of the cover, dear? There we go. All right. It gave me great joy in writing it. It was a very heady experience. I still have a few of my mates who are still around who helped me with it. And it made me realize, once again, this is a central experience really of my life and a first step on my way to Quakerism. So in Africa, from 1961 to 63, this young white guy raised in a Midwestern small town was given an opportunity to observe the life in a tiny village in one of the most impoverished countries in Africa as a volunteer for the Peace Corps, which you all remember as the ambitious program of J.F. Kennedy. And then for the next 2 years, 63 to 65, I was a staffer in one of its most dynamic countries, Nigeria. And so this book tells not only my own naivete, but also that of the United States engaging that part of the world in the 60s. I begin by showing the early stages of my service, the confusion of those days, in a chapter I call Here We Are, So Take Us, about getting in and trained. It was not easy. Could I have the next picture? This is my first wife, Sandy, and me at the exam that you had to take. Thousands of folks applied for the Peace Corps in that first year, 1961, and it was really big news. Yeah. And when Sandy and I were in our mid-20s and not firmly settled, immediately applied, we had to take a screening test, and we were considered newsworthy. We were in the Chicago Daily News. That's where this picture came from. And I was even quoted to the effect that we felt compelled to apply. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. We thought of ourselves as really perfect candidates. The Peace Corps wanted not brainy people, BA generalists, and as we were then. But part of the chaos of the early days was getting Peace Corps' attention. We actually moved to D.C. in July of 61 and barged into headquarters, pretty much saying, here we are. And at the end of a fairly short conversation with a desk officer, he said, we think you're suited for Sierra Leone. Well, at this point, we uttered those words that were spoken really by thousands of prospective Peace Corps volunteers in our era. So where is it? And the next picture will show it to you. Sierra Leone is not easy. There we go. Right there on the hump of Africa, the little purple spot is Sierra Leone. It's hard for me to imagine today how unknown it was, because now it's made the world news mostly tragic, and to no small degree has become the focal point of my biography. Meanwhile, the Peace Corps was making its own special demands. We never knew much about the security checks we underwent, but at some point, FBI agents mounted the porch at my parents' home, and my mother, thinking it a big honor, invited them in for Midwestern hospitality. It's worth recalling at this point just how much the Red Scare affected Americans back in those days. A senator had made it seem as though our State Department was dominated by communists and had many people looking for Reds behind every tree. But there were, of course, good reasons why the government should know the reliability of these idealists going off to represent the United States in many corners of the world. How about the next picture? So amazingly, after innumerable medical and psychological screenings, briefings, and social events, about 50 of us flew off to Puerto Rico for training only about a week later after we'd started. I believe it was October 9th, 1961. We went to a camp for outward bound training because Sergeant Shriver, whose name I think you all know, thought that a demanding physical routine would build cohesion. Shriver was right, but the fact is we were all going to be teachers. So why all this running, rappelling, swimming, survival hiking, and no teacher training and no Sierra Leonean in sight? As an example of the weirdness, we spent a lot of time drown proofing. That is, learning to stay afloat for an hour. Not very relevant for an English teacher. And then on our survival hike, our team got lost and had to be rescued. Again, it was chaotic. So let's go on to the next piece of our training and a little more misdirection. Next picture, please, Joko. So on November 4th, 1961, 4 weeks after our arrival in Puerto Rico, we flew from San Juan to New York for another 6 weeks of training at Columbia Teachers College, which is what's shown here. Now remember, we're headed to Sierra Leone, one of Africa's most impoverished countries, but we're going to train in Manhattan. Consider the fact that on our very first night in New York, some of us attended a concert in Carnegie Hall. Already you can see that this training had its wacky side too. The program looked good enough from the outside, at least from an academic standpoint. We had several prominent Africans as speakers, and we had instruction in Mende, the largest first language in Sierra Leone. So what was wrong? As far as Mende language training, here's the problem. I write, quote, "Here Peace Corps inexperience really laid an egg. For if there were 12 languages in our new setting, folks there must have found a way to communicate with one another." Indeed, they had, through a pidgin language that was mostly English and fun. Hello in pidgin was howda body, and goodbye or see you was we go see ya, so that even monolingual Americans should have picked it up rapidly. And there was more silliness. Fewer than half our group would be placed in areas where Mende was actually spoken. I wish instead that we'd heard more about local religions, for one of our group's conclusions later on was that no one had met an atheist. Anyway, our training then was flawed. Of course, we had a great time, and something wonderful did happen in New York City that's worth passing on. I need the next picture, please.
Wow.
Here is basically the highlight of our time at Columbia. Remember, in 1961, Peace Corps was new and rather glamorous, and those of us who applied got a celebrity treatment. In our case, Eleanor Roosevelt came to visit. The picture you're looking at is not very clear, but there's something odd you may be able to see. Here's my own recollection, quote, "I remember one detail very clearly 6 decades later. In my distinct recollection, the room was so crowded for her audience that many of us had to sprawl on the floor. In fact, I sat close enough to Mrs. Roosevelt that I could have rubbed her ankle. I didn't, of course. That picture doesn't quite show, but I think you can see a gang of us on the floor. So, okay, enough about training. By the time I left my Peace Corps service in 1966, the training had gotten pretty sophisticated. It was conducted in the host country, for example. But now let's go to Sierra Leone. Next picture. So Sierra Leone again on the hump of West Africa. Stanley and I were posted to a tiny village, maybe 200 people. It didn't make this map. It was in the southeast of the country. It was named Jimmy Bagbo. As befitting traditional Peace Corps volunteers, we lived rough. That is, we had no running water or electricity, or for 5 months a car. Even more difficult was the fact that the village had no market. It looked like we were in for a tough time. That is, to live like our neighbors did. We adjusted, but with the help of a living steward named Saidu, that is a servant. We did not want to be colonialists with servants, but had no choice but to hire help. By the way, we didn't want to be missionaries either, but I will acknowledge at this point that without missionaries and colonial servants, there would be many fewer schools and health services in Africa in those days. But I decided either I could teach or I can take care of the household. I couldn't do both. So let me explain. Unlike the thatched huts of the townspeople, we had a modern-looking prefab house. I'm sorry to say I have no picture of it, and it gave a false impression. There was a kitchen with a range, but you had chopped wood or otherwise fire it up in order to cook. There was a bathroom looking just like those we occupy today, but it didn't really work. Here's what I wrote. That January, when we turned on the taps, the water came out red, and it would turn brown as the dry season wore on. We very quickly exhausted our supply, for the, quote, running water descended from a storage tank on the roof and had to be manually hoisted there from a nearby stream. Porters, hired by the school, brought the water in buckets they carried on their heads. They climbed a ladder to the roof, and they dumped the water into the tank. Moreover, for us to have a hot bath, water had to be heated on the stove. By the end of the dry season, our brown water baths would be pretty perfunctory. Let me just interrupt. I assume most of you know that Africa has dry and wet seasons, not cold and hot like us. At this point, I need to say that many of our neighbors probably never got a hot bath. And let me say more and quote from a story about life in rural Africa. You see, in this book, I tell often funny stories about our experiences as volunteers. But in my fiction, which I started writing at that time, I read about the hardships of the indigenous folk. Here are the samples of each. First, from this book, something that happened in our very first week. I quote, the thatched roof of Mr. Macaulay's outhouse. Macaulay was a colleague of ours. Outhouse across the grassy verge from our house caught fire, and I rushed to help. I thought water should be thrown on the surrounding houses, but where would the water come from? This wasn't the approach to be used. Mr. Coker, another colleague and neighbor, simply instructed the boys to pull off the remaining thatch, and the frame was left barely scathed. The fire was then on the ground where it could be beaten out. I lent my own big feet to the beating process and thought my neighbors appreciated it. One boy left me stunned by stamping flames out barefoot. The first of many, quote, strange sights we were in for in our new society. What I assume you figured out is that there was no water in the dry season to put out any fires. Now, about one of the hardships of my neighbors, the little stream near our house, the one I told about where they brought the water for the roof, became the source not only of the water in our tank, but for one of my short stories. Occasionally, someone found an alluvial diamond in the stream, which is enough incentive for impoverished residents to spend hours panning in its sluggish flow, much as the 49ers did in California. I once saw a young miner carried from the stream and learned he died from probably pneumonia. I published a story about the event, setting it in the rainy season when the roads were basically impassable and a sick person could not be brought to Bo, which is the provincial capital, for medical treatment. Premature deaths like this and infant mortality and hunger were common. Just so you know, if I tell you jollier stories about my own life, I was aware of my own luck. Let me talk about one of my own comical misfortunes as a teacher. I mean, the next picture. I'm with some of the boys in the corridor outside the classrooms. Here's what I wrote. Sandy's assignments were English and African history. Mine, English, geometry, French, and soccer. The English and concomitant literature courses were fine. My other assignments were more problematic. My father had once been a math teacher, but my own interest in geometry lay pretty low. Worse, I was to teach a language I didn't speak and coach a sport I had never played. The French I thought I could manage, where there was a textbook. Too bad, of course, that it dated to 1928 and referenced baguettes and streetcars, but I felt I could adjust. Football, that is soccer, presented a greater problem. I had never even seen a soccer match. Still, I was raised in a small Midwestern town and was used to amateurish volunteering. So I went to the field my first day in an accommodating spirit. Let's see what can be arranged. Alas, there sat the ball and a group of boys standing around waiting for me to show them what to do with it. I said a couple of words and kicked it, though I mostly missed. It dribbled a few feet. My recourse was to ask one of the boys to show me what he could do. Here came a tremendous swoosh, and the ball sailed 50 yards in the air, bounced, and flew another 10 yards, and finally stopped rolling just before it left the field and entered the primary school grounds. I was forced to confess, and that was the end of my career as a soccer coach. Let's go on to the next picture. Okay, here I am in the classroom. Classroom teaching went better, but look here at my blackboard. A few planks nailed together and painted black. Unfortunately, glossy black, so it was very hard to write on. And as I note in the book, that was the only AV available. Now, the Jimmy folk and the boys were very welcoming, respectful, good, and hardworking. Still, I must tell you about my culture shock, or what in chapter 5 I call culture shock squared. Culture shock is defined as frustration over the loss of familiar cues, just little things that don't seem right. Here's what I wrote. One symptom, in my case, was yelling. I seemed to have shouted through the lessons until a boy complained, and Sandy said she couldn't hear in her classroom because of all the noise I made. I went to a doctor in Bow, that is the regional capital, with a sore throat. I was wondering if I could actually die of a sore throat, and he suggested I tone it down. So I stopped yelling, and my throat felt better, but I was still grumpy. Here are things that made me a grouch. And if they seem silly, well, they were. That's culture shock. I quote, the most outrageous thing was townspeople who came visiting just at dinner time. I didn't know what to say to them about their bad timing, nor how to ask Saidu, again our steward, who prepared strange European foods, suitable and sufficient only for us to what to say. One of the visitors, I recall, looking at one of our magazines upside down. I knew he was illiterate, and he exasperated me no end. I mean, we're talking about some really serious offenses here. What was the cure? Believe it or not, a holiday trip to Timbuktu. Can I have the next picture, please? It's not at the end of the world. It's in Mali, and it's a renowned center of early Islamic learning. Our trip would make a long presentation in itself, and I did get a published short story out of it, which I'd be glad to tell you about. But here's my point. When we got back to Jimmy 3 weeks later, I found myself saying, wow, it's great to be home. Irritations in Jimmy? Not that I can recall. What a good time this place affords us. There's a corollary to this story. This is what I call the squaring of culture shock, as I term it. On the way back, we stopped in Freetown. That's the Sierra Leone capital, where we'd left our Jeep. And there I found an issue of the New Yorker with an article by James Baldwin. And one day and alone in my Jimmy house, I sat down to read it. Let's have the next picture. Here's what I write. I soon became absorbed in James Baldwin's writing of the hardships of his early life, the racist epithets, the insults, and so on. As I read in dismay, I reflected I was the only white male for miles around, and even though I was a rather poorly trained teacher in a junior secondary school, I was treated by my hosts like a distinguished visiting professor. There in that comfortable chair, I had a bit of a meltdown. It might be thought of as reverse culture shock. Okay, let's go on to the next picture. I had plans to blow on this thing, but I guess I won't. Take a moment here to show you a memento of my Jimmy life that I acquired in 1962. Of course, it's ivory, but 60 years ago, we weren't sensitized to the ivory trade as much as we are now. This is a chief's horn to be blown to announce his arrival in the village. It makes a strange noise, so I won't blow it. Our chief was running for parliament and needed money, so he offered this to us. I think we paid £5. That was less than $15. By 1963, as we contemplated our next move, we loved our Jimmy life, but Sandy was pregnant with our first grandchild on either side, and I had a job awaiting at Peace Corps headquarters. And let me explain how I earned it. This is another story. The Peace Corps was sending recruiters to all its countries to find PCVs, that is, Peace Corps volunteers, for staff. Made sense. Here's what happened, another somewhat comical incident, and I quote, we sat in our front room facing west toward the carpentry teacher's house. I believe we had just started speaking when I said, there's a snake. And indeed, a small adder had reared itself up in the walkway and ran from our porch to the road. This was not a monster, but still, it was a dangerous intruder, and I instinctively rose to do something. I went out the front door, stepped off the veranda, picked up a stone from the walkway, hurled it, and decapitated the snake. I couldn't believe my luck, which was greater than I knew. The man from D.C. was watching and mightily impressed. I didn't know what to say, which was just as well because the rest of the interview was strictly pro forma. At Peace Corps headquarters later that year, I found a file with my name on it that included the recruiter's statement to the effect that I had casually killed a snake, with other wording to suggest that it was all part of a day's work for a good volunteer. Hire that man, it seemed to say. The title of this chapter, by the way, is, quote, qualifying for Peace Corps staff. So I had a job waiting. We got back to the States in July 1963, but because of visiting family, we missed the big August event. Let me remind you about it. Next picture, please, Yoko. The March on Washington, of course, August of '63. But we had our own civil rights action a bit later as we waited for our next posting. And of course, I want to tell you about it. It's worth reminding folks what our nation's capital was like back then, despite the romance of Jack and Jackie. I quote, the Peace Corps offices had many black employees, but was atypical. In my failure to understand this, I made a painful blunder. Sandy Roby, that's our daughter, and I were living in a huge apartment building on Connecticut Avenue. It was the first time either of us had ever lived in an apartment house, and I fear we didn't inquire as to whether it was integrated. We felt comfortable, and it was close to Peace Corps headquarters. Next picture, please. Then Walter Carrington, our program director in Sierra Leone, needed a place to stay. Well, he too awaited a new assignment. We recommended our building, but I began to wonder, I asked a building supervisor if there were black residents. Oh, yes, he replied. There was a band of black musicians occupying the top floor. I resolved to confirm this statement. I went up one morning to the top floor, but all I saw, of course, was a corridor with closed doors, and all I heard was silence. Still, I wanted to think affirmatively, and so I urged Walter to apply. Somehow, however, no apartment in that huge building could be found for him. This distinguished native son, Ivy League graduate, director of a successful Peace Corps program, director designate of the Peace Corps in Tunisia, and an eventual ambassador to Nigeria, was turned away. I've forgotten where he went for lodging, but we broke our lease and imposed on fellow return volunteers for a week until we could find new digs. So Camelot was not all it should have been. But let's go on back to the Peace Corps in Africa. Stan and I were then posted, this is the fall of 63, to northern Nigeria, where I was designated associate representative, which is to say deputy director of the huge northern region. We left the District of Columbia on November 22, 1963, and most of you know what else happened that day. We get to National Airport, and here were people strangely hovering near TV monitors. We learned on the plane of Kennedy's death. So I'll just pass over the rest of this story. We were stationed in Kaduna, then the northern capital, where we had very different experiences from Sierra Leone. I had an administrative supervisory job. I handled the accounts. I had corresponded by letter with the PCVs and others at their work sites, and I oversaw our staff, which numbered, so far as I can recall, only two, Emmanuel, a clerk, and Ibrahim, our driver. So now I have another story to tell. Quote, these two involved me in one of the dramas of my communal life, the only time I've ever been called as a witness in a criminal proceeding. I'm quoting this now. The setting was such as an American would expect in an imposing courtroom, holding a judge's bench, lawyers' tables, and a jury box. So I fail to recall if the judge wore a black robe nor any particulars of a jury if there was one. But I stood in a witness stand near the judge. Lawyers asked me questions, and a stenographer recorded my answers. And it all proceeded in English. The crime was a robbery that took place in our Peace Corps office on the second floor of an office building. It was an open and shut case. The robber was Ibrahim, our driver, who one night scaled the exterior wall with the help of blue friction powder on his hands and feet, and apparently entered by a window left open. If I remember rightly, he found my petty cash box and made off with a few Nigerian pounds. It was easy enough for the police to track his assets, given the blue handprints decorating the outside wall, in addition to which Ibrahim helpfully left the bag of powder lying on the floor of his home for the police to find. The only remaining mystery was who had left the window unlocked. Someone assumed to be his accomplice. This is where matters got complicated and my testimony would be required. Ibrahim identified Emmanuel, our clerk, as his accomplice. Emmanuel was charged. He protested vigorously, and I supported him. On the witness stand, I noted that Ibrahim, who was Hausa, ethnic group in that area, spoke almost no English, and that Emmanuel, who was Igbo, seemed to speak no Hausa. Moreover, I testified accurately that I had never seen them talking together, even greeting one another. This was only a few years before the Igbo speakers of southeastern Nigeria tried to break away and create their own country of Biafra. When Hausa Igbo speakers of southeastern, Hausa Igbo relations inflamed by religious division, as well as language and cultural differences, were poor. My testimony was somewhat speculative, but correct, I think, and Emmanuel was released. This was not the end of the affair for me. A U.S. government office had been breached, and the State Department, in the person of the counsel who worked right downstairs from us, felt a need to investigate. So a visiting fireman appeared in the office one day to ask me questions. Yes, it was true that there were file cabinets that Ibrahim might have accessed. Yes, it was true that I left them unlocked so that he could easily have taken innumerable files and read about my announcements of impending visits up country or volunteers' appeals for assistance on some matter, had he not been a non-English speaker and illiterate to boot. The investigator felt the weight of his assignment. Security had been breached. So today, somewhere in a Washington file cabinet, a demerit is recorded against me for allowing a potential spy the chance to read state papers. Back to my canoe reality. As I state in the book, I lacked the close contact with our hosts that I had in Sierra Leone. My big job was driving long, lonely stretches to visit the volunteers. Northern Nigeria, those days, it's been broken up since then, was bigger than Texas. And there were no places to stop, no ways to get lunch or gas. Lorries going slowly, as trucks that you couldn't pass. The roads were often terrible. You can see laterite roads here. And sometimes you had to take a ferry to get across a river. I once rode a canoe across the Niger River, but that's a story for another day. I'll start wrapping up with a long story about visiting a market in Ilorin in the southwest quadrant of my touring map and my purchases there. Could I have a picture, please? This is a tiny carved stool I literally bought from under a young woman, a very slim girl, in fact. Surely not very comfortable even so. Let's have the next picture, please. This is another one. You can see how it is carved out of one tree trunk. I should say this is a Nupe people, and they're very artistic, do a lot of carving. And this day, I'm talking about being in Ilorin, I had time to kill. I don't quite know why, but I had time to spend in the market. And I also responded to a striking display at an open-air stall. Dozens of glass Venetian beads. Much later, I discovered they had been a medium of exchange dating to the 15th century. But I knew nothing about this. At this point, I saw them only as a beautiful oddity worth bargaining for. So here's a sort of a jolly story. Quote, I thought, in effect, let the games begin. The vendor and I took seats of some sort across the display of her wares and began a long negotiation. We must have provided an hour's pantomime for anyone interested in this exchange between a local and a Baturi, that was Hausa for a white person. The vendor's English was limited to numbers, no and sorry. My Hausa was inadequate, but I understood the drill. As soon as she made an offer, I let out a cry of pain. I was not conveying rage, of course, but despair that she could ask a poor man like me to pay such an outrageous amount for her beads. In truth, her price was not that bad, but I had to protest or I would have disappointed her. Her next move was to throw in one or two extra beads for the same price, and I would calm down but still convey despair. Maybe feign the act of walking away. So she would offer more beans at a somewhat reduced price per item. After each offer, I would go through a repertory of acceptable responses. Arms flung out in dismay, vigorous shakes of the head, a frown to go with a counter offer, which I knew she couldn't accept. Soon she was grinning. By the time we finished, I had agreed to buy upwards of 100 beads, and we were both laughing. That's bargaining, which of course we don't do here, but I guess we used to. In any case, what was I to do with all these Venetian beads? I didn't know. But like a compulsive gambler, I couldn't leave the table. So I made a show of lamenting the fact that I had been so misled into making such a mistake, and we parted good friends. I really appreciated the fact that she played her role perfectly. Truly, it was a great way to waste an hour and a few shillings. So I had adventures. I was enough to generate a couple of short stories. And so to close, in November 1965, after 2 years in northern Nigeria and almost 4 years in West Africa, we returned to Washington, where Peace Corps made me East Africa training officer. That was the Peace Corps in the early days. And I got a trip to East Africa, of course, out of it. But let's go on to the next picture, Yoko. So to wrap up, having spent the first half of the 60s in the Peace Corps, I spent the second half at the University of Wisconsin, where all sorts of protests were going on. So I had a very interesting decade. During my Madison period, my Sierra Leone novella, A Wind of Change, was published. It was based on an incident where school kids 50 miles east of Jimmy Bagbo burned down their own school in the doubtless mistaken belief that the authorities would have to rebuild it and better. I'd be glad to tell you about that too. Here's my collection of Africa stories, and Yoko will flash that up. The Beauty Queen of Blanca is where I collected my African stories. So at a previous presentation, someone asked what stimulated my writing in Africa. I responded, it was usually the pain I saw in situations there. People suffering, but otherwise it's simply the mysteriousness of it, this very different culture. I got a PhD at Wisconsin and at Drexel, but my best education basically came from this Peace Corps experience in Africa. Can I answer any questions?
I'm just amazed at your luck at getting out of Nigeria before everything hit the fan in February of 1966. When the Hausa started murdering Igbos. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 66 basically, and we had left in November of 65.
No, you said that, but then in 66 is when they were murdered. I've spent a lot of time in Nigeria. I've been there a few times, and it was a few years ago, about 11 years ago, I was the guest of the pilot, the chief pilot of Biafra. And that was interesting. He wrote a memoir about it. And what happened, well, I mean, you know what happened, but 30,000 Igbos were murdered in the north because the British put the military in the north because they could handle the Hausa. They didn't want it in Igbo land because they couldn't handle Igbos because they're highly educated and they were, they just couldn't control them. So the reason for the breakaway of Biafra was because Igbos were being murdered. They didn't want to be a separate country. They wanted to be a real country, but they felt they didn't have a choice. And the Captain Ope, whom I know, he actually escaped from the north in a train, in a water something or other. In the train, he sort of climbed into a water barrel or whatever it is steam trains use. And so it was a terrible, terrible time.
Yes, well, I think the primary method they used was to starve the Biafrans, as I recall. They cut off the...
that's what happened afterwards, and it was just a terrible, terrible thing. Yeah. So you were lucky you weren't there then. My gosh, would have been horrendous. But I was in Sierra Leone in 2010. I went there with someone who's very interested in maternal mortality, And so in 2010, 1 in 10 women were dying in childbirth. Sierra Leone, I mean, I don't know whether this is worse or better than when you were there, but the amount of death in childbirth in Sierra Leone is the highest in the world.
Yeah, it has not developed as much as we would hope. It's bad. In fact, well, it's a long story, but I never went back, and my daughter, who was born there, had never gone. And part of it was that terrible things just keep happening. In the little town where we lived, Jimmy Bagbo was apparently turned into a concentration camp during the Liberian Civil War, which spilled over into Sierra Leone. So, and things I'm told today are still pretty rough. The roads are terrible and so on. Anyway.
Yeah, I visited a little.
Horrific.
Yeah, I visited a little. I spent about a week on in a village on the border of Liberia and Sierra called Pendembu. But it sounds like it was around the same area as you, because Bo was the closest big town. Yeah.
Probably 20 or 30 miles away. We were between that and Bo.
Okay. Yeah. But it sounds like you did really good stuff, good work. Very good. I'm glad you went.
Greg,
I bet you made a huge difference to a lot of
Greg,
people.
I hope so. We tried.
Greg, I'm wondering if you could say what you thought about the effectiveness of the Peace Corps in Africa in general. Did it come up to the goals that the Kennedy administration had for it? What kind of difference do you think it made to the people there?
Well, that's a very big question, but I do think it made a difference only in interpersonal relations. The spread of English, which, let's face it, is the world language now, and people need it to improve, and to the growth in the number of people who are educated at college level now.
Okay.
It's just that the old problems of corruption, tribalism, these 12 ethnic groups they talk about, they interact by speaking pidgin English, but they somehow have these terrible suspicions of each other, like the Hausa and the Igbo. And in Sierra Leone, not so bad, but the Temne and the Mende are the two dominant tribes. They have some suspicions of each other. And that doesn't go away very easily.
Yeah.
Well, they speak English Creole, and in Haiti they speak French Creole. That's what I couldn't understand anything.
Well, it is a little tough. I do think that we should have been trained in Creole or Pidgin. They're very close. And Creole is what was spoken in the capital city of Freetown, which was founded by freed slaves from the United States, of course. And so they did start out with English, and now that's spilled over into the country. There are small differences, but I can't tell you what they are. But anyway, Mende, again, less than half of our group went to a Mende-speaking area. So what was the point of training us in Mende when here was this pidgin language that was a universal language?
Greg, do you want to talk about a student who came to your home afterwards?
Oh, well, okay. I didn't talk about that a little bit in the book. I said we had a ward, one of the townspeople, town kids came to live with Sandy and me in our home in Sierra Leone, and then 10 years later he appeared in our home in West Philadelphia. He lived with us again as he went to community college here, and he's now an American. I've lost all track of him, but anyway, yeah. So yes, we were very close to the people there. In Nigeria, that wasn't possible. Another problem in Nigeria, and I have a chapter titled "Where Are All the Women?" That was the problem. Muslim, and you didn't meet women. I'm used to socializing with women. I like women. Most Americans do expect to have women in their social occasions, and it just wasn't the case there. And just generally, because of my job being mostly on the road, traveling literally hundreds of miles, and wondering if I was going to find a gas station in time or the tire would go flat, I didn't have much interaction with the Nigerians.
There are plenty in Philadelphia.
Nigerian?
Oh, yeah. plenty of churches. Yeah, I used to go to. There's a couple I used to go to. I mean, the best one is the Catholic Ibu Church in West Philadelphia.
Probably more Evos than the houses. And the houses were very conservative, obviously. They're the ones who kept their women in Purta. And the Evos were very progressive. You know, I knew a lot of, not a lot, but plenty of Igbo women and Sierra Leone women who were really out there getting educated and talking and so on. But in Nigeria, you know, they were covered up and hidden in their houses. So
you weren't interacting with Yorubas? They have the best parties. If you want to go to a Nigerian party, find a Yoruba.
Buddy. Yeah. They're voluble, let's put it that way. Yeah. And when I went to this, I talked about this market in southwestern and northern Nigeria, where I went to bargain. That would have been a Yoruba woman, not a Hausa woman. It was it was a mixed Yoruba Hausa area, although it was Muslim. And there were plenty of women in the market. And that made it much more interesting because you go to the northern markets, like Kano, the big capital or big town of northern Nigeria. And in the markets, too, everybody's a man. Kind of boring.
That's amazing.
That was 60 years ago, of course.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's probably still the same. That's very interesting.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Now, Yoruba are split pretty much half and half between Christian and Muslim.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Ibu is the mostly Catholic, so it's a very different.
Christian, yeah.
Well, Catholic, with, you know, about 90% of Catholic, the Ibus. And houses.
I hadn't realized that. Okay. But there again is a split. So here are all these, the Hausa are just Muslim, period.
Right.
The Igbos are not Muslim, they're Catholic or other Christians. Right. And so there was that problem. They spoke different languages. Yeah. And the very fact that the Igbo women were out there working, getting jobs, that probably Hausa men thought they could handle. All these things were a problem.
Well, the main problem is the British decided these three very different countries should be one country. I mean, they should never have been one country. Nigeria should never have been one country. Well,
now there are 12 or 14 different regions. Does anybody else have a question? Elizabeth?
36 states.
Huh?
Yeah.
All right, so is this the time to say thanks? And
thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
That's been extremely informative, and thank you for your thoughtfulness in putting all this together.
It's fun.
I hope you tell lots of people. Now, what's your book again? Can you show your book again?
It's called The Peace Corps, Early Days.
Peace Corps, Early Days.